All right. Welcome to the Solid in the Saddle podcast, Dr. Rachel Mottett. We are so excited to have you this morning.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to talk to your audience.
Oh, you're welcome. All right. So, why don't you just give the audience a brief introduction about you, what your origin story is, what you do, and what kind of riding you do?
Absolutely. So I am a almost lifelong horseback rider. I was put on a horse when I was 5, and I've been doing it for decades. I currently own a hunter and a jumper. So I compete in the hunter jumper disciplines, and I reside in the Ocala, Florida area where I do that. I have an extensive background in the horse world, pretty humble beginnings, mostly English disciplines, but I decided I'd go to college and continue my studies in equine science, and that took me through a bachelor's, master's, and PhD, where I eventually went on to work for a feed company as an equine specialist. And about 4.5 years ago, I decided to start my own business as an independent equine nutritionist. So what I predominantly do, I teach people how to make nutrition recommendations for horses. So I have a program, it's called the Equine Nutrition Advisor Program, and it's for either equine nutrition enthusiasts, veterinarians. I've had professors come through, I've had trainers, body workers, the whole gamut. If they're individuals who love nutrition and want to make recommendations, I teach people how to do that and make it into a either side hustle, or some of them have gone on to make it their full-time job. So that is predominantly what I do. I also consult for a number of companies, feed and supplement companies. I do some technical writing, so the whole gamut. And then lastly, I do one-on-one consulting. So people who have horses that maybe have health issues that require dietary intervention, or maybe they just want peace of mind that they're feeding the right type of feed and they're not wasting money on useless supplements, they find me and we do a consult and I help point them in the right direction. So that in a nutshell is what I do. Did I miss anything in there?
I don't think so. That is so cool. Oh my gosh. So you are for horses what an equal or what a nutritionist is for humans.
Yes, absolutely. 100%.
Very cool. Okay, so what are some things that you can see a difference in horses when you optimize their feed program and take out, like you said, those useless supplements, or you add in what they actually need?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I mean, the thing about horses and nutrition, a lot of times simple is our best approach. If you can get an appropriate and good quality forage fed at the appropriate amount, that is your foundation. When you get that piece in place, you can do a lot, because you can be feeding a lot of feed, you might be feeding good vitamins and minerals, but if your forage is not good, that feed is going to have a very hard time picking up the slack, and your horse isn't going to look, feel, or perform as good as you want it to. So step one is always going to be having good quality forage, because that's going to make a huge deal in the overall health and condition of your horse. And then when I help horses, optimize nutrient intake, we see big differences. Sometimes it's a matter of energy, how much fuel they have in the tank. There's different types of fuel that we can give performance athletes that help them do the maneuvers that are called upon in their specific discipline. Sometimes too, we run into issues where a horse might be getting way too much or way too little of a certain nutrient, and that can lead to health issues. So you can see a big change when you optimize the nutrition in all facets, particularly health of the horse and muscle integrity. That has a lot to do with the quality of protein, not just feeding protein abundantly, but protein being made up of individual amino acids, some being essential, some being non-essential. It's really important to have a good, high quality blend of amino acids. So optimizing nutrition can make a huge difference in, it's kind of like humans. We are, largely a reflection of what we put into our body in terms of how we feel, how we function, our alertness, how we perform if we're an athlete too. So that all is quite similar.
Wow, that is so cool. Even just hearing you talk about complete versus incomplete protein and thinking about what that looks like in a human diet. Now I'm fascinated. How do horses get complete proteins if they don't eat meat?
Well, that's a great question. So when we think of, complete protein, we're kind of talking about those sources that are abundant in essential amino acids. The most complete or close to complete form of protein that we see in the equine diet would be soybean meal. There are a number of other protein sources, but that would be very common in a US equine diet. It's a crop that we grow abundantly. It's something that we commonly see utilized in different equine feeds. So there are a number of ways also to add individual amino acids to help round out the profile of protein in that feed. But I'd say soy is a big one. Alfalfa meal is another one you'd see. Many other ingredients, and most ingredients, of course, offer protein to some extent, but your highest quality and available in the US, I would say usually is going to come from soy or alfalfa.
Okay, so can you dive into the safety of soy a little bit? So I saw this on your page and I was fascinated that your research has shown that soy is actually pretty safe. Can you talk about uncooked versus cooked soy and how horse owners can distinguish between what is good for their horse and what's not?
Yeah, so soy is an interesting ingredient because, soy, it comes under a lot of scrutiny for different reasons. And I did an expert panel several years back with like 6 PhDs who all contributed to the conversation on safety of soy. The first thing, there's concerns about pesticide residue, things like that, that would really be undetectable in that crop by the time it makes it into horse feed. But I understand that people have concerns about that. People worry about things like phytoestrogens, which are estrogen-like compounds that are found in soy as well, and that in the human diet, if we eat too much of those, that can impact hormone balance. We don't see that in the horse per se, or we don't have that documented, but there's a lot of human type of fears around soy that trickle down into the horse world. And I would say, largely they're really unfounded as it comes to the horse and safety of soy, and especially as a good quality amino acid source when we talk about soybean meal. It's a really, integral part of the equine diet. A number of companies have made soy-free products, but really that has more than anything to do with consumer requests versus actual equine need. So I would say I feel very comfortable feeding products that have soy included. I don't worry about that impacting hormone balance. It doesn't, at this point, I don't have good evidence in hand to say that it contributes to leaky gut. That's sort of another theory around glyphosate residue. I feel very comfortable feeding soy products. Soy has a few different ingredients it offers. Soy hulls are a good source of fiber in the diet. Soybean meal, great source of protein. Soy oil is another common equine ingredient. The biggest thing with soy, kind of as you had alluded to, it must be cooked prior to feeding, because if it's not, it has a compound called trypsin inhibitor, which can impact nutrient absorption downstream in the small intestine and can impact protein absorption or digestion. So it's something that absolutely needs to be cooked because of that anti-nutritive factor. So my recommendation, if you find soy in feed, and horse feed in particular, typically it has been cooked. Typically it is not going to be just a whole raw soybean. I have only run into that a couple times in my career of people growing their own ingredients and feeding it that way. But when it's put together by a company, it has been cooked and it's usually not in its whole form. It's either meal, oil, or the hulls. So typically that's not a concern that I would have.
Thank you so much for diving into that. Would you mind just talking about the difference between alfalfa fed as hay and alfalfa meal and then soy and soy meal? Because I'm not exactly sure what the difference is on those, but I'm super interested in it.
Yeah, so I mean, the meal is going to refer mostly to like the particle itself. So the meal would be like the ground up, what's the best way to put it in terms of, hmm, this part we might cut out because I like on off the cuff definition, like a meal has everything to do with like the particle and that portion of it. In terms of soy, I don't believe I'm not 100% sure if it includes the hull or not, but yeah, can we cut that part out?
Yeah, no, we can totally cut it out. I just wanted to make sure that I wasn't talking about the wrong thing when I was, because it sounds like the
Yeah.
soy meal is different and alfalfa meal is different. Is that right?
Soy meal, say that again, sorry.
So is the alfalfa meal different from alfalfa hay?
Really not. No,
Okay,
it's
okay.
like
I just wanted to
ground
make sure
chopped
that I
hay.
wasn't talking about like, like we feed alfalfa hay and then you were talking about alfalfa meal as like a grain supplement or something like that.
No, it usually, yeah, it's a little bit different though, because sometimes a meal from like a whole ingredient won't include every single piece of it, but I can even like Google that really quick on soybean meal. That's actually an awesome question. I just haven't thought
And
about
yeah,
it
we'll
in a
cut all
while.
this out. I wanted to make sure I wasn't asking like a very stupid question about like, okay, if you add in alfalfa meal to your hay, what does that do? And people are like, no, it's the same thing.
Okay, so I just did a little Googling. Uh, Extracted flakes cooked as soybean meal. So yeah, there's certain, depending on what it is, meal would be kind of an indicator that it's been processed from its original form. And in terms of alfalfa meal, it may just be the protein-rich portion. Let me see. It's a great question. Blah, 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 blah. Or it may actually be the whole plant. So that would be one we'd have to double check on. That's a great question. Fun. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. I don't know if you're waiting for me on something right now.
No, I'm good. If I was just waiting for you to Google. If you
Oh, yeah,
are done, we
yeah.
can kind of
No, we
move
can
on to
move
the
on from that
next
one.
thing. Okay, cool. Um, so thank you for diving into the research on soy because I know, just like you said, there's a lot of fear in the human world about it. I know there's a lot of fear in the cow world about it. So I'm glad to hear that it actually is a good source of protein for horses.
Yeah.
Okay, so a lot of our um, audience has older horses. Can you talk a little bit about the basics of feeding for older horses and then um, maybe some supplements that could benefit an active older horse?
Yeah. So horses are kind of interesting in each horse will hit senior stage at their own spot in life, right? And there's a big differentiation when you have a true senior horse, and oftentimes that's reached some point in their mid to late 20s or even early 30s. And there is a stage in life of the horse where they become less efficient at digesting long stem fiber. So at that point, and that's, due to just insufficiency of optimal function of the digestive tract and also issues in dentition that happen as a natural part of the aging process. For that reason, a lot of times as horses get to that age, they do need the roughage component or the fiber from forage in a very small, easy to digest particle. So we think about with senior horses that are at that stage that aren't digesting hay very well, we think about doing a complete feed. And a complete feed in the US would be referred to as a feed that has, of course, all the vitamins, minerals needed, but also has the forage component built in. And typically those feeds are going to be fed at a minimum of about 6 pounds per day. Some senior horses that have very poor dentition and don't do well on hay need up to 15 pounds of a complete feed per day. It's a horse by horse thing. But a lot of times, you have horses that are seniors in their 20s, really don't need a complete feed, but some of the things to be an indicator on how to best feed them. What I would say is maximizing forage is always going to be your number one step, keeping that horse in ideal body condition. So there's something called the Henneke body condition scoring system. And the condition of your horse can really give you a lot of clues about how well the nutrition is performing. So maximizing the forage, making sure body condition is good. A lot of seniors, they suffer from some muscle wasting, and that can happen too in our older population of people, have a harder time putting on and maintaining muscle mass. So sometimes with seniors, we really need to think about making sure that we're providing a quality source of protein in the diet through forage and through the feed. A lot of senior feeds actually have a bit more, like 14% protein, and that percent is not as important as the quality, but a lot of times you'll see a bigger boost of protein in some of those senior products because muscle wasting is very common as the horse ages. Now, when it comes to supplements, there aren't many things that pop into mind as something that would be necessary. And as I mentioned before, a lot of times simple is the best approach. So if you've got good quality forage, you've maximized that. Step two, making sure your horse is in ideal body condition. They're not obese and they're not underweight. And then making sure that you're feeding a balanced ration. And the way to know if you're feeding a balanced ration, you can either talk to a nutritionist, or the first good thing to look at would be the back of the bag of that feed and look at the feeding rate recommendations, because every feed is going to have a recommendation for how much needs to be fed to fulfill vitamin and mineral requirements. So you want to make sure that you're hitting that target for that particular feed, because let's say you're feeding a product and it says based on your horse's weight and workload, you should be feeding 5 to 6 pounds a day. And let's say you're giving your horse about a pound per day. That would be the equivalent of only taking, a quarter of your daily vitamin and mineral. You're shortchanging some of those essential nutrients. So what you need to think about at that point is, okay, how much feed, or maybe lack thereof, does my horse need to maintain ideal condition? And is this the right product to do that? But that feeding rate recommendation will be a good guide. And if you say, you know what, my horse only really needs a pound per day, and this feed is recommended at this 5 to 6 pound feeding rate, I'm going to switch and look for something that you can feed a pound per day and get all your vitamins and minerals in that pound. And there are products like that called ration balancers. But those are some important things. When it comes to supplements, offering like a free choice salt lick, that's not necessarily what we typically think of as a traditional supplement, but horses should always have free choice access to a form of salt that they'll actually lick. And that's actually great even if you put it into their feed each day. If you live in a cold climate, when it gets snowy and cold and the temperature fluctuates a bit, horses are not as good at drinking water. So encouraging water consumption by adding salt AM, PM, you can do 2 tablespoons a day. That's something that can help them drink more water. But when it comes to supplements, especially those targeted for senior horses, one that I think of would be different joint supplements. And the data behind orally fed joint supplements is so poor, indicating that they really don't do a whole lot of anything. I would not be inclined to spend my money on something like that. I would talk to my vet maybe about other options for that senior horse if there was some arthritis. Now, there are people that I work with that will feed, joint supplements and say, I saw a huge difference. And I'm not going to tell you you're wrong, but as a good steward of the science and just, knowing where those compounds go once they get in the body, I would say, more likely than not, you're going to have more success going with something recommended by your vet if you are seeing arthritis and stiffness. But yeah, so I don't have any magic bullet supplements for seniors other than good quality hay, good feed or ration balancer, and free choice salt and fresh water.
Wow, that is so valuable. And I have a couple questions now.
Mhm.
I know so many people that feed joint supplements. Thank you for just kind of bringing it out there that the orally fed supplements are really not research based to help horses. Um, are you saying kind of talk with your vet about different arthritis management things like and I know this isn't necessarily your scope of practice, but um,
Mhm.
joint injections or Adequan instead of feeding something like glucosamine or Optawise or something like that?
Yes, yeah,
Okay.
and I mean, keep in mind, the joint supplement thing. Like I said, if you're having really good luck with it and you're like, I swear I've seen a difference, by all means, if you're buying a reputable product, you can continue with that. But yeah, since I'm a nutritionist, not a veterinarian, I try and stay in my lane a bit. But what I personally have the most success with my own competition horses would be Adequan. If they need a specific joint injected, the Adequan, you can see a difference sometimes overnight. So for me,
Mhm.
even when they're young, if they're working really hard, jumping is quite hard on the body of a horse. So I like to, if I can, try and do maintenance with Adequan just to keep them feeling great.
Mhm.
But it also depends on the clinical presentation of the horse. There's some horses that get different anti-inflammatory compounds. A lot of times that's not long-term use, but chatting with your vet based on the full clinical picture may be your best route to go. If you want to, a lot of people feed joint supplements as preventative type of agents, and it's not harmful, but when I think about what we know to work better with greater efficacy and noticeable results, I still just don't feel confident personally in spending my money on orally fed joint supplements.
Which can be very expensive. I know that from
Yep.
experience. Okay,
Yes.
and then the next question that I have about the salt intake is you said 2 tablespoons per day or up to 2 tablespoons per day. So we have 4 of our horses just out on pasture, and then they have access to a really big water trough. It's like a cattle trough.
Mhm.
And so they have salt blocks out there, but
Mhm.
it would be really hard for me to go out there and give them each 2 tablespoons per day, as
Mhm.
opposed to the horses that we have in that we could
Yeah.
maybe like add that to their water. Um, I'm just kind of wondering how you measure that and how you administer it.
Yeah, so I wouldn't add it to their water
Oh, okay.
because, yeah, I would, unless it was some type of flavored electrolyte, and you'd want to keep fresh water separate for them. But the 2 tablespoons a day, that would be your maintenance. And it's really hard to overdo it with salt unless you have a horse that's like eating mouthfuls and doesn't have access to fresh water. The best way to do it, if you can, is to add it with the feed to mix it in. However, sometimes it'll sift, so that can be a little easier if you've got dampened or soaked feed. If you don't have that option, if let's say you've got a big herd of horses living outside and maybe they don't get, a daily ration, I would say put salt licks out. Some horses are very good about going to a salt lick and licking that salt. Some of them are not. So, what you could do, have a few different forms of salt. If you have like a loose salt, in a tub and then a salt lick, maybe a Himalayan salt, a few different forms, because interestingly, some horses do have very certain preferences as it relates to salt. And they do have a physiological drive to consume sodium. However, sometimes I would say perhaps the texture of the salt block or the taste really is off-putting and they're not as good about consuming as much as they need. Whereas some horses, they'll lick the salt lick every day, but intake can be variable. So having a few different options, there have been some studies looking at how salt is presented in terms of consumption. And I think like loose salt is a bit more preferred by horses. But, it's something that if you offer a few different forms or if you're concerned about it, let's say you've got a big, temperature snap, you're worried about it, you could always go out with like an electrolyte paste if those horses aren't getting a daily ration. So I would get a little creative, but I would make sure I would not necessarily mix it with the water because salt does it can be a nutrient, or sodium in particular, that is not always the most palatable. And that's one reason that you don't see salt in abundance in horse feed, is because it can make a horse get a little more picky about that feed. And if you have a feed that horses aren't wanting to eat, you don't have a viable product, right? So this is something that you can get a bit from the feed, but usually not to an amount that would fulfill their daily recommendation. But just make sure that you've got some form of block that they can get to freely if you're not supplementing it daily.
Wow, that is so helpful. And I just want to dive into this a little bit more
Hmm.
because I do have a horse that's very picky. She will turn her nose up at any new thing that I put into her grain. So I have to be careful. So if she won't touch her grain with the salt in it, is that something that you recommend doing a syringe of, like mixing a little bit and kind of making almost like a paste, and doing a syringe into her mouth? Or is that too aggressive?
I mean, if I was, so there are a couple companies. Well, there's one company in particular. Smart Pack makes something called Smart Salt, and it's a pelleted salt. You can try that. There's some electrolytes out there that are really palatable too. There's one that a lot of horses tend to like, and it's a fair electrolyte. It's called, oh my goodness, Apple a Day, and it's got flavor. So Redmond Rock also makes some really good electrolyte supplements. There's a number of companies that have like a flavored electrolyte that you can try. So I wouldn't feel inclined personally to feel like I needed to go out and syringe it. I would try different blocks, like I said, Himalayan or like a Redmond Rock or loose salt or white salt lick. Some horses just absolutely will not touch it. And they do fine and they thrive and they live long, healthy lives. Your horse will get some electrolytes from the hay and grain. So I would say if, in those cases, you offer what you can, and let's say you're at a competition, you've got a horse that's sweating severely, making sure that you maybe do like an electrolyte paste just to help with water consumption, hydration. That would be advised, but I wouldn't feel a need to syringe those that are super picky unless there was a concern, or like we talked about before, like the horse isn't drinking enough. There's high colic risk, the weather fluctuated like crazy, you've got 4 feet of snow. Those would be times maybe I'd consider it, but usually I would, not be quite that concerned.
Okay, thank you so much for those recommendations. I do have a question about an electrolyte feed that I fed this summer. So I had two horses with me on the road, and then the one that competed, I would give her this I'll just call it, it was Replenimash,
Yeah.
and she loved it because it had the sugar in it, and I could get her to eat any grain with it,
Yeah.
even with how picky she was. She just loved it. And then I noticed that she started to lick and nuzzle the ground. Like when she was home, she would like literally be eating dirt. And so I thought that that was just really weird. I didn't put it together that it was related to the Replenimash, but again, I had these two horses on identical feed programs as far as their hay, grain, every other supplement. And then
Mhm.
when I had to retire that mare and started running the other one, I started running the other horse and giving her the Replenimash. She started to do the same thing. She started to lick and nuzzle the ground, like she was eating the dirt. And so
Mhm.
my husband has a background in animal nutrition, like cow nutrition, and so he thought
Mhm.
that there was maybe a nutrient deficiency. um, could that have been caused by the electrolytes, or was it like they tasted so good that the horses were trying to find more of it? What do you think about that?
So that's an interesting finding, and I haven't heard that before about the Replenimash in particular. And it's interesting that that observation happened, it sounds like, in more than one horse. There's not a good way to really explain that. I would try and identify, is it the same area of the yard that they were both picking at, the dirt? Was it, timing wise? It sounds like you investigated that a little bit or thought about it a little and were like, okay, timing wise, it happened the day after they had the replenimash. It's hard to say specifically what may have caused that. A lot of times when horses eat dirt, if they're taking the little roots out of the grass that are sweet, or if there's something in the dirt that's tasty or novel, that behavior, it's hard to understand exactly why, because horses, what we've learned through research, are very bad at distinguishing which minerals they're deficient in or have too much of. And we know that because, the studies will show horses on a diet where they're receiving a full plane of nutrition, and those horses will display behaviors, kind of like you mentioned, eating dirt or eating things they shouldn't, as much as the other horses that might have those deficiencies. So horses are very poor at knowing where their deficiencies are, other than sodium, and that being a part of the salt. But the other nutrient, I should say, fiber is a big one. And lack of fiber in the diet can lead horses to eating bark off the trees. They can do that for reasons of boredom too. Also, wood. A lot of times, I used to work as a feed rep, and I lived in Minnesota, and I would get calls in the winter like, our horses are eating the fence boards, like what's going on? Where's the deficiency? It's like, well, first, make sure they've got enough fiber in the diet. Second, in the winter, when they don't move around as much, and if they're in a small space, they get bored. So sometimes it's boredom, sometimes it's just a habit due to domestication, sometimes it's novelty or just good taste in that specific area. I was consulting with a client yesterday, and she was telling me her horse will eat dirt, but only at this one show venue. I'm like, there's got to be something tasty in there, but it's hard to know exactly what. So there isn't a good explanation, but there wouldn't, I mean, I don't know off the top of my head the composition of the replenimash, but there wouldn't be anything that I can think of that would be in there that would trigger consumption of any type of dirt or mineral. But that's an interesting finding and observation.
Yeah, thank you. And I mean, I'll pay attention to it this summer if it happens with
Yeah.
just more than just those two horses. They were also on the road a lot, and it could have been due to so many other things. I just thought it was so fascinating that the one horse started to eat the dirt after I started her on replenimash. So I was wondering if that meant anything. Okay, so you said that horses are really bad at distinguishing if they're deficient in a nutrient. Do you recommend to I know you're big on forage. Do you recommend to have your hay tested or to have your horse's blood drawn or like a hair tissue mineral analysis to decide what they should be fed depending on what they're deficient in?
So you really can't get a good gauge of horses' total nutrient status by looking at hair or by pulling blood. The only things that we can gauge well when it comes to whole body status from the blood would be selenium, vitamin E. We can get a good idea of full body status. A lot of times when your vet's pulling blood, they'll look at a few different minerals or electrolytes in the blood. That's more for kind of total body homeostasis and trying to identify if there's some type of health issue going on versus if the horse is getting adequate amounts of those electrolytes. And the body has kind of its own unique mechanisms of restoring a homeostasis of some of these different things in the blood, whereas within the tissue, that might look a little bit different. So it can be really hard to infer total body nutrient status by pulling a blood sample, other than the few that I mentioned. And I'll just come out and say it, do not waste your money on hair mineral analysis. That is the biggest way to waste your money. Well, not the biggest. There's a lot of ways to waste your money with horses, but it is so unreliable for nearly everything other than maybe some metals. I would say metals might be detectable in hair mineral analysis, but there have been a number of individuals who have even sent hair tests from the same horse, claiming they were different horses, and got back different results. A friend of mine who's a PhD nutritionist, she had a horse that was a paint horse and had two different colors of manes. So she sent in the two different colors, said it was different horses, and got different results. It was the same exact horse. So there's really no validity to the hair mineral analysis for full body nutrient status. With that being said, if you can get a hay test, that's ideal. A lot of times, us nutritionists, I would say 95% of the clients I work with do not have a forage analysis in hand. So I have to rely on some assumptions about what's in the hay based on variety. Although, what I often do, because a lot of nutrients, you've got a little wiggle room. Mother Nature's not perfect, so if we overdo it a little bit, it's better than underdoing it, and it's not the end of the world. We try and make sure things are optimized and balanced, but sometimes if we don't have a hay analysis, we make assumptions based on tens of thousands of forage tests for certain varieties and maturity. So if you can get a forage analysis, what you'd want to take it from the same cutting and same crop, same field of hay. And if you have a batch that's going to last you through winter or might be, available for several months and it's all the same cutting and crop, then it would be worth getting a hay analysis and taking samples from 4 to 6 different bales, making sure that you have a full cross section from the layers within the bale all the way to the outside. That's when it's good to do that. However, if you're someone like me who lives in Florida, don't have a lot of storage space, things are very moldy, dusty, damp. Like we don't keep a lot of hay at one point in time typically. Usually the hay I get lasts for 3 weeks and then I have to go buy more. And it's great if I can keep consistency with the same, vendor and they get the same cutting and crop. However, that's not always the case. So for me, it wouldn't be an advantage to test the hay because by the time I got the analysis, I'd be on to the next batch and that might look a little bit different. So what I would say is if you don't have a hay test, not the end of the world. If you do, it's always optimal, but if you don't, you don't. Then your nutritionist makes a few assumptions and you make sure that by visual appraisal, it looks good. You can't tell everything by looking at just, the hay visually. Also, you can tell a lot of times nutrition shows up in the quality of condition and muscling of your horse. So a lot of times you can tell when maybe your hay isn't as good as it could be, or maybe it was a drought year and you don't have access to good quality hay. So what you can do, try and find some forage pellets and mix that in so you can get a bump in consistency. So that was a bit of a long-winded answer. Like,
Oh,
but if you
that's
don't have the hay analysis, it's not the end of the world.
yeah, that's super helpful, especially where we live in Montana. We grow a lot of hay, and it would be so interesting to just know what we're feeding and what the difference is per field. We have I think we have 3 different pivots. And so it'd be really interesting to know what the nutritional composition is in each of those fields and how that might be suited to different horses. Okay, so speaking of different horses, I am very, very interested in this topic. So in humans, we have humans are very um, we have a problem with over carbsumption. So we eat a lot of carbs, and sometimes that leads to metabolic dysfunction in humans. And so that's not necessarily a problem for human athletes because they need those carbs to because they're burning them and they're using them, so they need it for muscle tissue repair, that kind of thing. But tell me about that in horses, how we might be able to distinguish different feeding programs for an active horse that's actually being worked 5 to 6 times a week, competed on, that kind of thing, versus a horse who is ridden once a week or once every 2 weeks, that kind of thing. And what do their nutritional requirements look like?
Okay, so that's a great question. And that's like an hour-long seminar answering those pieces because it's a big question. You started on kind of, carbohydrates. So I'm just going to touch on that real quick because
Yeah, we can
carbohydrates.
limit it to that if you want. I just
Oh,
I
yeah.
know like I know that it's such a huge problem in humans, this metabolic dysfunction and that kind of thing. And we do have one metabolic horse, so I'm very curious
Yep.
how that happens in horses, even young horses, and what the
Yep.
nutrition requirements are for like a very, very active horse versus not.
Yeah. So, one of the biggest problems that we see in our horse population, particularly in the US, is equine obesity. Equine obesity is a huge problem, and it's when you have fat that accumulates to a level it does in an obese horse, it is a bit of a ticking time bomb, and it can influence insulin sensitivity. And that is a big predisposing factor to insulin dysregulation. I would say that there's a genetic predisposition for certain breeds too to have metabolic issue, but the biggest problem we're dealing with, I would say, is obesity. Because you think about the traditional diet of the horse being, corn and oats, and these horses were doing more, well, not all, but doing a lot of work, that's a 50 to 60% non-structural carbohydrate diet. The diets that you find commercially available now are many of them are very low in non-structural carbohydrates. So that's a consumer request, and that's also not all horses need that, big punch of energy from corn and oats. That's really, that's the traditional equine diet, but one that we've, evolved from in many ways. So I would say when it comes to carbohydrate intake, that likely, most horses are significantly lower than they would have been in previous decades. And the biggest issue, though, is not necessarily, and some horses, of course, are going to be sensitive if you're overwhelming them with starch and sugar every day. But the biggest issue is obesity. And that's tipping, everything. It's causing this metabolic cascade where all these things are interwoven, including obesity, laminitis, and insulin dysregulation. So, in my opinion, that is, a big part of the problem that we don't often think about. We're just like, oh, need low sugar, low starch. Well, you have a lot of horses getting low sugar, low starch, but they're still obese and they still have insulin resistance. So, that's a bit of a soapbox of mine that we have to think about learning how to body condition score our horse because I read a figure a couple weeks ago that I think it was over 50% of the US horse population being overweight or obese. And, it's nobody's, well, there's a few different areas that it comes from. I wouldn't say it's anyone's particular fault, but we're offering sometimes way too much of a really good thing and not enough exercise to burn the calories that we're putting into them. So we have to be really cautious about good condition in our horses. In humans, it's a little bit different. And equines, their digestive tract is designed differently. They're very efficient at digesting fiber and fermenting forages, although depending on the discipline that's done with the horse, you do need carbs in that diet to some degree. I mean, you need carbs in the diet of really any horse. There's different types of carbohydrates, but I would say, that conversation is very broad and it's carbs aren't the biggest, I would say, culprit. They're definitely a big factor in controlling and maintaining good blood glucose homeostasis, making sure you don't have sharp spikes in that. But the bigger issue would be the weight and the condition of the horse. Okay, off my soapbox. Sorry.
No, thank you so much for touching on that. I think that it's just so fascinating to me, and I'm really interested in it within our own herd, as far as what types of feed we can feed. We kind of have everything on a low starch um, program, or even just alfalfa pellets for their quote unquote grain. But it seems to affect one of our horses so much more than the
Mhm.
others. And so, speaking of carbohydrates. Can you talk about ulcers and myths around ulcers? Maybe that is a myth that I have heard, that a higher sugar diet leads to ulcers. Um, Bust that myth if you need to, and just tell us all about ulcers, because a lot of our audience, they're barrel racers, they haul their horses a lot. And um, I don't really know anybody at this point who hasn't at least heard of ulcers as a problem in performance horses.
Yeah, so performance horses, it's estimated that over 60% of them are affected by gastric upset or ulcers and or ulcers. Particularly your performance horse population is extremely susceptible, and really high, grain diets are definitely a factor. They can be a factor, but it all comes down to, like, from a nutritionist standpoint, it depends on size of the meal. Is that horse getting 6 pounds of sweet feed AM, PM, or is it like a pound and a half of a high NSC feed AM and PM? Because that wouldn't be as great of a concern when I think about grams per meal. But yes, really high non-structural carbohydrate diets can absolutely be a risk factor. But altogether, it's very multifactorial. And the best work to look at, Dr. Ben Sykes, he is really renowned for his work looking at EGUS, equine gastric ulcer syndrome, in horses and how to manage that, what the risk factors are. He's done a lot of the research on different drugs that help treat and prevent. So his work would be what I would refer to as, kind of our gold standard for how to manage that, because there are many risk factors, low roughage diets. If you have horses, beyond, a moderate or high NSC amount in the diet, one huge risk factor that a lot of us don't think about would be prolonged periods of time without hay in front of the horse. A horse stomach is continuously secreting acid, and they need to have something in that stomach to help soak that up and to help ensure that the vulnerable portion of the stomach that can ulcerate is protected. So having fiber flowing into the stomach as much as possible without promoting obesity is the best, from a management perspective. Now, sometimes horses get stressed, sometimes horses go off hay a bit, especially when hauling, but the more you can keep that forage in the diet and in front of them, the better. And I say that with the caveat without promoting obesity, because many horses, when they get the hay buffet, they become obese. And that's where slow feeder systems have become very popular, because you're keeping that forage in front of them and it's taking them longer to eat it. So that small stomach that empties quickly and continuously secretes acid, hopefully, if you've got a good small feeder or slow feeder system, still has hay in it for most of the day. If not, access to it almost all the day, but at a lesser amount, so that you're not giving them that buffet, which makes them obese. That leads to the greater likelihood of metabolic issue, but you're mimicking more of a natural eating system where they have access all the time. So that's going to be a big factor for ulcers. Stress is another big factor. There's been studies, they even look at moving a horse from one pasture to the other, or maybe their friend moves from one pasture to the other. So many things that we do with horses stress them out well beyond our scope of comprehension. And sometimes where that shows up is as ulcers. You can even have a horse that has a cushy, environment, nothing's changed, nothing happened, and they can still get ulcers. So it is a big problem, and it's highly prevalent in our performance horse population. Exactly why it's so prevalent, I would say, is probably a combination of factors, and some of those we haven't maybe identified entirely. But the best thing from a nutritional standpoint, I would say, is trying to make sure that your horse has as much of a continuous access to forage as you can give them without promoting obesity. That's a great management tip. And when it comes to equine ulcers, there's a few distinct types. There's squamous and then there's glandular lesions. And glandular lesions are much less impacted and likely less caused by dietary management influences. So it's best to, if you suspect your horse might have ulcers, chat with your vet, see if getting a scope is the right thing to do. There are some other nutritional strategies that you can put in place. If you are going to be at a show or if you are going to be hauling, there's a lot of good gastric buffers out there. One that I really tend to like is Purina Outlast or alfalfa. There's another of, there's a lot of good supplements. I do some consulting for a company called Kaleido. We make a product called Protect GI, and that's really great for horses that are high risk of ulcer reoccurrence or horses just coming off of ulcer treatment. So there's some good gastric supplements out there, and a lot of those products, like the Outlast I mentioned, are kind of like an equine Tums or Pepto-Bismol. So you give them a serving, give it a few hours, that's your window of efficacy. And if you have a stressful event going on, maybe you're about to take them into the trailer to haul them down the road. Maybe you're about to go for a ride. You can give them that as a snack to help buffer the contents of the stomach and hopefully prevent ulcer formation, worsening, splashing of gastric acid on the vulnerable portion of the stomach. So those can be really helpful in those cases. And, those are different from like an ulcer guard. A lot of people who haul and go to shows will give ulcer guard. So that's going to be what's called omeprazole, which is our drug that can do a really good job at blocking most of that acid secretion into the stomach or that production. So that's something that if you have a high risk horse and you're taking them somewhere stressful, I would, consider that. Anytime I haul my horses, I move them from south to north, between summer and winter. And when they're on the road for a few days, they're always getting that ulcer guard just to protect their stomach. Make sure that, when you're actually giving that omeprazole, you have a long acting drug versus just a gastric buffer. So those would be some things to think about for hauling performance horses. Think of some type of prevention and doing the ulcer guard. That's your maintenance dose of omeprazole. It's the same compound that is GastroGuard. GastroGuard is what you're going to treat with typically if your vet recommends that for your horse with ulcers. But that's really our gold standard treatment. And in terms of potency, that's really the best option that would be out there. But the ulcer guard is a great preventative type of strategy for many horses. And I encourage you because it is a drug. Again, I'll say, talk to your vet and make sure that's the right fit for your horse. But that would be a common practice in people doing a lot of hauling and showing when they're on the road.
Wow, that was so helpful. And I just had an idea that I want to run past you.
Okay.
So, in my mare that was very ulcer prone, she is on a slow feed all like 24/7. She has a hay net and she can eat all day long. But when she gets in the trailer, I do the same thing. So I get her a hay net build that she can eat whenever she wants, and she never touches it the whole time. So she'll eat when we get to the barrel race or whatever. But sometimes I'm hauling like 7 hours or 8 hours, so I always stop about every 4 hours. Should I be giving her the Outlast in the middle? Because I had great success with Outlast this summer. I really, really liked it. But I know she'll eat it. Like I know it's a kind of a
Mhm.
grain, so I know that she'll eat it. If I know she's not eating in the trailer, should I be stopping more often to give her Outlast just so that she does have that buffer?
You can give it every like 3 hours if you want, 2 to 3 hours, even. I mean, it's hard to know exactly how long it's going to buffer. Are you also giving ulcer guard? Are you giving some type of omeprazole?
Yeah, so I do a quarter tube of omeprazole before she gets into the trailer.
Got it. Yeah, I mean, it wouldn't hurt when you're doing, that in combination with like that maintenance dose of omeprazole certainly wouldn't hurt. It'll help get a little something into the stomach, or even like, I don't know if the horse gets alfalfa currently, if you've got a pound of alfalfa or two, like you could give, just to improve the taste or kind of introduce something that might encourage them to eat and not tons of it. You don't want to introduce an entirely new, really rich forage right before a trailer event, but a pound or so or two of alfalfa can sometimes help kind of sweeten the pot and get them eating, but sometimes they just don't eat well due to stress and they just kind of hang out in the trailer. But it sounds like what you're doing is good. You definitely could try the alfalfa or the Outlast more frequently when you're on the road. I'd say it's like I said, it's hard to know exactly how long you're going to get that buffering, but I'd say, if I had a horse that was high risk and I wanted to keep them as comfortable as possible, I might do it every 3 hours just to put some buffer in the stomach and try and keep them as comfortable as possible.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
And then the next question I have is, and if you don't have time for this, Rachel, we can totally stop. But I just wanted to ask about allergies. So, how do you how can you tell if a horse has allergies? And is that something that you should run blood for? We have an experience with that where we had a horse turned out that ended up with scratches all over. The scratches were not treatable until we took her off the field with clover. So we, by I guess, process of elimination over a very frustrating year, figured out that it was because of clover. And now that she doesn't have any access to clover, she has no scratches. Can you talk
Mhm.
a little bit about feeding a horse with allergies and how you test for that or how you can
Yeah.
see it happening?
So what you're describing kind of sounds like if there's clover in the field, probably more a physical touching of that specific species versus actually ingesting it. It could have been related to both, but feed ingredient allergies and sensitivities or different types of hay, they do exist, although they are very uncommon. They're quite uncommon and they are very, very hard to pinpoint. I would say doing testing, looking at there are different companies that do allergy testing. I would not waste your money. Usually you can tell if your horse has, an allergy just based on the symptoms that you're seeing. And what I would say as it pertains to nutrition or ingredient allergies, if you see a response right after initiating something new, like a brand new feed, and all of a sudden you see a response or something, maybe hives, it's so hard to pinpoint, but I would say like 90% of the time in cases I've worked with, it's environmental in nature versus actual feed allergies. So I would say taking a look first at the environment. Are we in the middle of summer? Are the insects out? Did my horse move to a new farm? Did we move to a different state? This past summer was extremely bad for allergies. I had a horse getting many, many, many Zyrtec every day to try and control them. Still rubbed his entire tail out, had never ever done that before. But you have to become a little bit of an investigator at times and say, okay, was this a particularly bad year for allergies? Did this just happen in the summer and then subsided in the winter? Did this coincide with a change in hay? And a lot of times, too, when it comes to hay, it's not always, I would say, a specific variety issue. It's more of like a dust or mold type of issue that causes some respiratory distress that you're like, oh, they're allergic to that. They're uncomfortable eating that. So I would say people do allergy testing a lot. They send me those results based on, I would say the validation of that is pretty poor. It's a lot of false positives. And Dr. Jimmy Nichols has done some investigative work looking at particularly the flax assay that they have because her and I both and other nutritionists, every single horse was coming back allergic to flax. Well, there's an issue with their assay. And I mean, horses can have ingredient allergies, but I would say the technology at identifying exactly which allergies it is not on par with, identifying the culprit. So a lot of times we do a process of elimination if we feel like it is related to a feed or to a hay, and we remove that and see if the signs dissipate. And what you can always try and do to double test that would be to reintroduce it, at a later time. In your case with the clover, I wouldn't recommend that because scratches are a pain in the butt and they're really hard to get rid of and quite uncomfortable for the horse. But um, yeah, ingredient allergies are really, really tough. But I would say by and large, Usually it's environmental. So I would take a look at that first. If you do suspect there is an ingredient allergy, I have worked with some horses that definitely have those. We can find diets that eliminate potential culprits and see if the horse thrives on the new diet and kind of go from there. But your best bet is if you suspect it's actually ingredient or hay related and not dust, not environment, talk to a nutritionist and we can help navigate you because it is a bit of a process too.
Yeah, and that's super helpful. I am very interested by this because it was just like you're saying, a tissue irritation when
Mhm.
the ground was very wet. That's when it started. And then every time we turn her out in that field, the scratches would return, and it very well could have been a physical reaction to the dirt because really anywhere she has white hair was kind
Mhm.
of like crusted over it. It never, even to this day, it
Mhm.
hasn't quite healed. So I can see how a little bit of physical touch of the clover could reactivate that
Well,
scratches instead of it being ingested.
and I mean, it could all be intertwined. You know, if the horse does have a sensitivity, when there are allergies, or if your horse has a sensitivity to something and it's ingested, your immune system is always fighting against that thing. So does it do that if it's ingested as well? I would say hard to know definitively, but luckily in your case, you found the culprit, which many people don't. So that's good that you found a spot to move the horse to without the clover. But allergies are very, very tough. They're tough to diagnose and can be tough to treat.
Absolutely. Okay, so Rachel, the last question that I have for you is just can you give the audience like a basic myth buster of things that you most commonly hear as an equine nutritionist? So I know the first time we talked, I told you you probably could have saved me hundreds of dollars a month on supplements because, oh my gosh, there's always a new one, right?
Yeah.
Um, and so I love hearing you talk about just the importance of high quality and appropriately fed forage. And I think that is kind of the myth buster of them all. But can you just maybe touch on three or four things that you hear that you need to let people know that they are not true?
Oh, that's a great question. Let me think. A lot of people, so one big thing that people kind of get a little bit, well, okay. There's so many of these. I wasn't prepared for that question. That's such like an open question. One of the big ones that comes to mind is that alfalfa makes my horse hot. Some horses do end up with more energy on alfalfa because it is higher calorie per pound. It is higher protein than grass hay as well, but protein typically is not a very um, energy dense nutrient from a standpoint that protein isn't really metabolically converted readily into utilizable energy. However, because there are more calories in alfalfa, could it give a horse extra energy? Sure, but it's not necessarily alfalfa on its own that would make the horse hot. It may have more to do with just increased calorie content in the total diet. Some horses are sensitive to anything. So if you have a horse that alfalfa makes them hot, I'm not going to tell you you're wrong, but by and large, it shouldn't necessarily do that. But it does have more calories than grass hay typically. That would be, there's a lot of misconceptions about alfalfa in general. Another thing, gosh, after we hang it up today, I'm gonna think of like 10 of these. I just
Well, and that's totally fine. I think the alfalfa one is probably the biggest one. I hear that all the time as well. And um, I don't know if it's because I have an older horse, but I actually find that she's way hotter if she's on grass, like green grass,
Mhm.
than her typical diet of alfalfa. I'm like, who are you when she's when she gets turned out on a little bit of grass? So, but it's interesting that protein is also not really utilized as an energy source in humans because it has to go through gluconeogenesis, and that's kind of
Hmm.
inefficient for the body. So it's cool to hear that there may be something else going on in horses, like you said, it just has more calories or something like that.
We call that metabolically expensive. It costs the body energy to turn it into energy. So the body preferentially wants to utilize carbohydrates, so glucose as its energy source. That's its number one preferred energy, and proteins kind of last on the list. So it's it can be utilized in that way, but it's expensive for the body to do that.
Hmm. Okay, so my last question for you for the day, this is something that I ask everybody, is what is the best piece of advice you've ever gotten working with horses?
The best piece of advice I've ever gotten working with horses, nutritionally or just in general?
It can be in general. If you
Okay.
want to
Yeah.
make it nutrition related, we can, but also just, you're a very accomplished horsewoman yourself. And if you have a gem that you'd like to share with us, we're happy to hear it.
So this is very general, but I think this relates to riding, nutrition, to everything. Every horse is an individual. And what works for some may not work for all of them, even when it comes to supplements, even when it comes to feed. Some might respond a certain way, some might become energized on a certain feed, whereas others are always lazy. So I would say being in tune with the individual horse and just being aware of those things, I think can help us all be happier with our horses because they are individuals. They've got unique metabolisms too. And people would know that if you've ever owned a hard keeper or an easy keeper, they are unique. And so we have to get away, particularly with nutrition, with a one size fits all. And a lot of times, one size can fit most, but we've gotten so advanced when it comes to nutrition that we have a lot of options and we can optimize based on different factors. So I would say treating them like an individual is good advice for all facets of being an equestrian.
Yeah, I think that is great advice, Rachel. And I think pretty much everything you have said today has been very, very valuable advice. So our audience is just going to get so much out of this episode. How can they
Awesome.
contact you with Legacy Equine Services to learn more? So if someone wants to be a part of your course or if they want to do a one-on-one consultation with you, how can they get hold of you?
Yeah, thank you for giving me a chance to plug my business. I would say the best way to find me and to contact me, you can either go to legacyequine.com or find me on Facebook at Legacy Equine Nutrition or the group Equine Nutrition Education.
Wow, that's so cool. And just really quick, can you tell the audience exactly what services you provide again so that they know how they can reach out to you?
Yeah, if people have a horse that needs some help due to a health issue or a performance horse that you're having some difficulty getting looking, performing, feeling their best, I do one-on-one consulting. I work with full farms and I also teach equestrians and equine professionals how to make equine nutrition recommendations and to turn that into a service if it's something people want to do. So those would be my main focus.
Very cool. Well, I think that everybody who owns a horse should probably do a consultation with you just to make sure that they are actually feeding what they think that they're feeding and if it's benefiting their horse in the way that they think it is. We spend so much money on our horses, and even the best of the best supplements may not be what your horse needs. So I think that having a resource like you is super, super valuable. And I'm excited for some of our audience members to get to reach out to you.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for having me. This was fun.
You're welcome. All right. Thank you so much, Rachel, and we'll talk to you soon.
All right.
All right. Thanks.
Bye bye.